Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm glad you were able to make it. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. I'm working from home. So if you would send me a note on the chat that things are working and you can hear me, that'll be helpful so we can get this started. All right. I get some feedback here, so looks like we're good. So today, this is another one of these deep dive webinars that we're going to do. So the goal here is to cover some of the new features we introduced in the recent versions of FEC. We have a new user interface for building queries called Unified Query Builder. And that ties in with our search it interface as well, and kind of makes it easy to construct in-place searches that run on the server, takes care of the syntax issues among the different provider types, and helps get the in-place searches going quickly. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, construct some queries, show you how we used to do it versus how it's possible to do it now, a couple of tie-ins, and then we'll talk some more about Google Drive attachments, revisions, and the new packaging features we have. So let me start by sharing my screen. There's some functionality here to ask questions. So if you have some questions, feel free to use that to pose the questions, and then when we have some free time towards the end, I'll check that out and I can go through them and answer the questions. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. Let's see. Okay. We're on the screen now, so I'm going to start with a new Gmail acquisition to kind of walk you through the new functionality here. So let's say that we fire up FEC. I'm going to use this 3.13 that we have out right now. I'll start by loading a token so I don't have to re-authenticate with this account. And go through these settings. So you've probably seen all this before, so I'm not going to spend much time on the API settings and the case information here. Go straight to setting up the output path and the search. Okay, so we see the contents of the Gmail account now, and let's say that we want to run a search. And in our search, one of the common scenarios is that we have to limit the acquisition to participants sometimes, or date ranges, or in the case of Gmail, sometimes the Gmail labels. So this was a common request from the very beginning of when we launched in-place searches, to have a mechanism to kind of automate this a little bit so that you don't have to learn the search syntax of each provider in detail and have a unified interface. So before we had this interface, if I wanted to construct a search to search for these participants in Gmail, I'm going to show you that now so we can have a point of comparison. I would do probably something like this. So I would put this in a text editor. And then this down loose is 2 words, so I will put quotes around this to make sure that we don't have a coding issue. And then I would make copies of this for the different types of fields. So for this one, I would probably do something like this. So insert some froms here. For this one, insert some twos. This one gets some CCs and BCCs. And then I would combine these together like so. So I have the from to CC, BCC, and remove the extra line breaks that I have, and then flatten this. So it looks something like this. So I have this search constructor that searches for from to CC, BCC for those different participants in one line. So when I look at this, I'm hitting around 720 characters here, just about, just those, how many, 6, 7 participants alone. So number one, this takes a little bit of time to put together. it's error prone, and it gets lengthy pretty quickly. So imagine if you have 10 or 20 participants here, you could hit some limits on the provider side pretty quickly. And then you could add some more restrictions here if you wanted to, like, you know, I could say, for example, after 2018, 1/1, and before 2019, 1/1, and this, for example. So this is like a date restriction plus a participant restriction. But like I said, this was long, error prone, and the syntax differed among the different provider types we have. So instead of that, now we have this user interface that we call Query Builder. It's right here underneath the search bar. You launch this, and you have a few areas here. One of them is the participant area, where you can take your participant list and dump it here. It'll count them automatically, regardless of if you have some extra space here or not. You have the option to choose the different participant fields, like from to CC, BCC. So if you uncheck those, it won't search those fields. The important thing to note here, and one of the questions I get is, these participant fields are ORed among themselves. So if is going to search for this domain in the from field or in the to field or the CC or the BCC field, and the different search criteria like participants and the date range and the labels are ANDed among themselves. So if I also put a date restriction here, like I did earlier, 1/1/2018, 1/1/2019, and you have the calendar view here if that's easier, then it's going to search for these participants in the email participant fields, and the email has to be between this time frame to be responsive. If you wanted to, you could also throw in a Gmail label here. For example, let's say that I only want to search the inbox. Well, you could, if it's hard to spot it, you can run a quick search here, narrow it down to the inbox. And then when you hit convert to query, then FEC is going to do the work for you. It'll create the search syntax. So to compare, I'm going to put FEC's syntax here. So this comes in at about 600 characters. Actually, if I remove the inbox part, which I added on later, it's a little short of 600. So there's some savings here in terms of length. And you'll see that when you look, it'll take care of automatically, like the codes that you need to put in. It'll use a more compact syntax for Gmail and combine everything nicely. So you have one search query, essentially. So let's go back. So you could use this exactly as it is, and it is a query that restricts the acquisition based on participants, label, and a time period. But this is more like a restriction, essentially. If you wanted to use this restriction in combination with a list of keywords, that's also possible too. So I'm going to copy this here. I'm going to go to our search hit interface that we had talked about in the past, and I'll load a list of terms. So this is a list of expressions that are positive search terms, like these would make those documents responsive. So you could run them as they are, and you would get a search hit count for these terms. But if you wanted to use our earlier search with the participants and the date range as a restriction on these terms, so that any document has to have these terms in them, and also they have to be among those participants, and they have to be within the time period, and they have to be in the inbox like we did before. And you can paste that limiting expression that we created earlier, if you recall, with the time restriction and the participants and the label at the end. And you can run it again, and you'll see that we're getting much fewer hits now. And we got the 129. And we can convert this to a query now. So we'll have a even longer query, but this will start with the before and after, and then we'll have all the participants and the other restrictions that we define, and we'll be good to go. So this is, and if you save this and run it or acquire it, then you're going to get the results of that acquisition, essentially. So this is how it works for Gmail. So I want to touch a little bit on how this looks for, well, let's actually finish this acquisition plan as well. just so we have it, so we can have it complete. So you see that those 129 items that we found is what FEC found here because we constructed our search and done. So let's go back to doing something similar on the Exchange side, just to show you how that looks. So let's say that I want to use auth. And again, we have it in the same place, query builder. In this case, you're going to notice that we don't have the Gmail labels section because Exchange doesn't have Gmail labels. But you have the folders in the folder tree that we selected earlier here. So if you wanted to limit the acquisition to some of the folders like we did for inbox earlier, then you could do that to the folder tree. Just choose the folder that you're going after and then run your search here. So let's do something similar here, a similar exercise. If we were to run a participant-based search in Exchange, it would look very much like this, except for the date part, which would look a little bit different. And if I were to do this on Exchange with FEC's syntax, query builder, let's put our date restrictions in place. Now we get something like this. So let me paste this here for comparison. So you'll see that for Exchange, FEC uses a different syntax and the search length is actually a little over 230. So we cut down on the length even more on the Exchange side because we're able to use some shortcuts that Exchange search syntax has. So for received and sent, we're using this dot dot notation for a date range. And then for the participants, we're able to use the participants term. So instead of spelling out the from, to, and CC and BCC separately, we can use one term that says participants, and that'll cover from and to and CC, BCC together. And we're just, FEC is just including the participant terms in there one by one, combined with ORs in parentheses, and we're good to go. Now, if we wanted to do it differently and not search all the participant fields. For example, let's say that I want to search only the from and to, but not CC and BCC, although that would be a little bit unusual. Then things will change. You'll see that FEC is going to now search for from separately for all these different participants and to separately for all those participants, and we'll combine them. So we won't be able to use the participants term anymore because it covers all the different participant fields. We're going to use just the individual from and to parts. Again, you could pivot off of this and use this in the search it interface as a restricting term and go from there. Now let's look at how this works for Imap. So this is a simple folder here. You'll notice that the pre-acquisition search interface for Imap is quite a bit of a change from the other provider types because Imap doesn't have that free-form search query syntax that we use with Exchange and Gmail. So we have these individual search terms that we put in. But we built the same query builder for Imap as well. So if you wanted to do a participant or date range here, you could again fire up the query builder. Let's say that we have the same participants here as well, and we have a date restriction. And then let's say that we want to convert this to a query. Now, FEC will turn that into an Imap query for you. So it'll add in an OR group automatically the from and the to and the CC and the BCC for a domain, the other person's name, the email address, and the other domain and everything. And then it's gonna combine these two OR groups with an and this OR group contains two date restrictions or together. So the date has to be, the internal date has to be between 2018 and 2019, January 1st, and, or the sent date has to be between those dates in this case. Now, if you wanted to keep it to one of the dates instead of both, then of course you could modify this yourself. So you could kick out the internal date, for example, keep it to just the sent date and run your search that way. Or you could take out some of these terms yourself manually and customize your search at this point. You could do the same thing in Gmail and Exchange as well. So there's always that possibility of customization, but the goal of this is basically to take out the groundwork as much as possible and have a unified interface across the different provider types so that you're familiar with the interface, and FEC kind of helps you in choosing the right syntax in as compact a way as possible that will be effective and efficient. So that's the plan here. Let's see, I think I saw a question here. This might be a good time to take a break and address that. Oh, so we have a question here that says, is it possible to run multiple queries? For example, you may want to run multiple participants in one query and then add perhaps one user in the from field and with some different variables in the query. So you'd have query 1 and query 2 run together. Well, there is no way to run two different queries at the same time right now. So I think I see what you're saying. So have one query and then run it and then save it somewhere and then run another one and then combine the results of those two queries in one place. This is not how it works at the moment. Right now, what we're doing is we're constructing a single query that gets passed to the server. Server executes the query, returns it back to us. In the case of the search hit user interface, where you can create a search hit report, then you can have separate expressions that are almost like a separate query, and then FEC still in the background combines them together and then runs them in one go, not separately. But I think that's probably the closest to what you're asking here. So you could have different queries there as different search expressions. They could be as long a query as you wish, and then you can combine them and run them essentially that way. Hope that answers the question. Let's see, I think I accidentally dismissed that. All right, so let's see. Okay, so I think we're good questions wise here. I'm gonna close out of these windows. The next thing that I wanted to tackle was the new Drive attachment and Drive revision acquisition. There are a couple of interesting things there, so it's worth looking at, and we can talk about some of the functionality, what we have in place, what we have coming up, and any requests that you guys might have. So let's go back again to our test mailbox. Let me answer one more question before I get into this. So I just got another question here about the searching. So before we move away from that, let's address this. So when queries are run and hits identified, can FEC export the data and recreate the folder path in Windows for where the hits resided in the original webmail account? Yes. So you can get the search hits, run a report as a CSV or a tab separated values type file with the search expression and the counts, save that. And then when you charge ahead with the acquisition, then the acquisition will reflect where those hits were found. So you're going to have the folder structure in the original webmail account or in the Exchange account reflected in your output where the hits were found. All right, so let's talk about the Drive attachments now. So you probably noticed that in I think a couple of versions before, we added a new option to fetch Drive attachments. So if you read the little help bubble here for this, what this essentially does is it examines the emails as you're requiring them. And if there are any hyperlinks in them that point to files on Drive rather than real attachments, then FEC will actually get authorization to access Drive on behalf of the user you're authorizing with here, and then it'll try to download those Drive attachments and save them. So that's that. And then the other option that we added later is the fetch revisions of the Drive attachments. This has some help information here too, but in summary, what this does is if some of those Drive attachments also have revisions, like you would have in some of the cloud storage providers, that you can have a file and it has multiple edits on it and they save that information, then you can actually request FEC to go and request those revisions individually and capture them as well. There are a couple of important considerations here. One is the permissions you need to acquire the revisions of a file are different than the permissions you need to acquire the file. So if you're the creator of the file, for example, and you sent it, then you have full access to the file and its revisions. So if you're collecting the creator's mailbox, then you will get all the revisions. But if you're collecting the mailbox of one of the recipients, then you may not have access permissions to get the revisions of the file. And FEC would note that, and you would see some notices about that, that those revisions could not be acquired because of a permissions issue. The other thing is choosing this option to acquire revisions can add quite a bit of strain to your acquisition in terms of acquisition time and throttling, because an attachment, a Drive attachment, could have potentially hundreds of revisions. So, if they all have to be fetched, then that's quite a bit of extra work. So our recommendation right now is to use this as needed. So I would probably do an acquisition with just the Drive attachments first. And then if you find that one of the Drive attachments is kind of a hot topic, a smoking on document, or you just need to know more about it, then you could target that individually by running an in-place search, for example, and get the revisions on that rather than get the entire revisions of the Google Drive, Google mailbox. The other thing you can do is, if you don't want to separate that way and you're concerned about completing the acquisition, then you could do two acquisitions, one without the Drive attachments at all, and then you could run a supplemental acquisition with an in-place search that isolates only the emails that have Drive attachments and run that separately to save time. You could put a little bit of time between those two acquisitions to ease off on the data acquisition from Google. That'll help too, especially with Google's throttling, and it will help you at least complete the Gmail acquisition first before getting into the calendars and the Drive attachments. So in this case, I'm going to choose both of these options. Let's skip over this part. You can output folder. So now you'll see that in addition to that, we have some new output option checkboxes here for MIME and MSG. So these are for packaging the Drive attachments with their parents. This is something we released in the most recent version. So before we were acquiring the Drive attachments, but they were kind of standing alone. So they would be in a different folder on their own. And to make use of them, you had to kind of match them up with their parents. So there were a few different suggestions on how to do that, but it wasn't super straightforward. Now what we did is we added these options here so that you could have FEC package the Drive attachments and revisions with their parent emails so that they're ready to go and ingested into an e-discovery or digital forensics tool. And when you do so, the tool will create that parent-child relationship for you because it's a zip file. So depending on how the tool works, presumably you would have some settings to have an attachment family relationship within the zip file, perhaps an option to treat the zip file as a folder rather than a file, and so on. So those are implementation details of the Discovery platform or the forensics tool, but as far as what we do, I'll show you your options here. So let's hit this mailbox. Let's run a search. I don't want to have to collect the whole mailbox for this, but as I was saying, you could run a search to isolate just the Drive items with a search that says has Drive. And I'm going to actually exclude some items that I had there for testing. And just a reminder here, so when you construct an in-place search like this, although it looks like you would naturally want to run this search, I want to remind you that you don't have to run it. If you know that the results are accurate and you've done it before, you could just save and go with it. The running part is just the preview. It's for your own information, basically. So I'm just going to skip over that part. and hit start. So we're starting the download process here. We downloaded the emails already. We're getting the drive attachments and the revisions. I'm demonstrating one of the things we added recently here. There's a little messages bubble here that you can hover over to see the most recent error messages. Here we're seeing an error message that says this file cannot be exported by the user. Reason, cannot export file. And there's going to be a couple of more error messages, I think. What I wanted to show you there is that, let's look at the exception log. So this error, the user does not have sufficient permissions for file, means that this file was shared in a way that prevents the user from downloading and printing it. That's one of the options that you have when you share a file with Google Drive. When you share by default, you give the user the permission to add the file to their own drive or download it. But if you restrict that on purpose, then if you are collecting the recipient's mailbox, then the recipient is not going to have permissions to download the drive attachment, and you're not going to be able to get that file because of Google's restrictions, and you'll see a message like this. I just wanted to demonstrate that here. We added this error message to our error messages cheat sheet on our online documentation. So if you encounter that, you know why that is. So let's take a look at what we got here. So we have the items folder. We have our, let me finish this acquisition here. We have our drive attachments folder. And before, we didn't have these two folders, so we would have just this stuff here. And these folders have the drive attachments itself. If you notice that the drive attachments are going to have file system timestamps associated with them. So these are the timestamps that we get directly from Google Drive, and we populate the file system timestamps with those timestamps so that you have good file system times on these files based on what Google Drive reported. So this file, for example, appears to have been created on 1:06 p.m. and then last modified on at 1:13, so a few minutes later. And then you're going to have the revisions in subfolders, again named after the date and time of the revision itself. And there's going to be these different PowerPoints here. So this is the structure for these drive attachment folders. Now we have two additional folders called package mime and package MSG. And these are essentially zip files. I don't have one.zip because that first one was the file that we couldn't download because of the attachments issue. If I open this up, so I have this email here because I'm on the package mime folder. So this is the parent message, and then this is its attachment, drive attachment, and then drive revisions all in there. So if you are, for example, a forensic tool or any discovery tool parsing this, then you hit the zip file first. Oh, I extracted it externally. I meant to open it. So you hit this zip file, you get this parent email on the root first. So that becomes the first element in your attachment family. And then you drill into the folder, which contains the drive attachment at the root. So that becomes your second item. And then underneath that, you drill into the subfolders where you have the revisions of the drive attachment. So in total, when you think about it, you have an item there that starts with the parent message, the real attachments of the parent message that are actual files that are attached to it, if there are any, and then the drive attachments of the parent message, and then the revisions of the drive attachments all in one package. So it makes it pretty easy to deal with this for review or for further analysis. Again, you'll see that although WinRAR doesn't show me here, when we create these zips, we preserve both the creation and the modification file system timestamps on these files. So if you have a tool that supports extracting the zips and capturing that information, which they should, then you'll get all those timestamps nicely populated. And that's another reminder that when you're playing with these files, you don't want to move them around with the tool that doesn't preserve metadata because they all have valuable file system timestamps. Let's look at the logs that we have here. So we have now, we have the downloaded drive attachments log. Hope it went into my other monitor. that looks like this. We have gone over this briefly before. So we have the drive attachment ID. That's the ID we assigned to this drive attachment. We have the parent message ID. That's the ID of the parent message. So in this case, it would be 00002.eml for the email version. We have the service ID on Drive. So this is how you access that specific file if you were talking to Google Drive API directly. This is where we wrote the drive attachment. This is our hash of the drive attachment. This is the MIME type Google Drive reports for the attachment. You'll see that for some attachment types there are external files to Drive, so not the native files that Google Drive has, like a Google Doc or a Google Slide or a Google Sheet, but external files like a PDF or a zip or a movie have hashes on Drive. Google Drive records those hashes in MD5 format, so you have that information captured here. If you choose FEC, if you tell FEC to make its own hashes in MD5 format too, then you can have a comparison point between those two values. I forgot to do that here. You have the file name, the creation and last modification timestamps, and then again for the external files only, we have the file size in bytes for the Google Drive attachments. For the internal native Google Docs, they don't have a file size, presumably because these files, until they're exported, they don't really have a definite size. They're just like a database record to Google. Once you go and export them, then Google turns them into a different standalone file format, like a PowerPoint, for example. And only at that point do you have the file size, but there's no way to query that in advance. We only know that once that export happens. And then we have the revisions log here. And in the revisions log, there's again those IDs, but this time we have the drive attachment revision ID, the parent message ID that ties it into its parent message, service ID for the revision, parent drive attachment ID. So this is the drive attachment to which this revision belongs. And then this is our output path for the revision, hashes we calculated for the revision. Again, for some revisions, we have MD5 hashes. We have some information on who modified that revision. So these were all last modified by this test account, last modified by this email, last modification time. This is the time that we use when we create that subfolder for the revision itself, size for the revision for some of them. And then for the native file types, Google Drive also provides some export links. So these are links that you could use in a web browser, for example, to go and download that revision yourself, but you would need authentication. So these are not immediately useful unless you're already authenticated with Google, with a user that has access to that revision. But Google gives you this information when we create, so we include this here in case it is ever useful. All right, so that's how we deal with Google Drive attachments and revisions right now. One of the questions that we get pretty frequently is this: why do we write the revisions out in a separate folder called Drive Attachments rather than embed them into the actual messages that we collect? So this, here's the parent message, for example. Couldn't we edit that parent message and insert the Drive revision in there, or the Drive attachments in there? Well, the answer to that is we could if we wanted to, but there are a couple of major problems with it. Number one, when you insert the Drive attachments and revisions into the original email, then that's causing some significant changes in the original message, changing MIME boundaries, changing metadata, the size, the hash, and also there's the risk that that could be misinterpreted. For example, if you create messages that way through FEC and then those messages get produced to another party, then the receiving party, not knowing exactly what took place before, might think that those messages existed exactly as they are in the mailbox, which is not the case. Those are essentially constructed messages. So we don't want to create that kind of confusion. The second issue is that Drive attachments or any cloud storage attachments can get really large. You could potentially have a video, for example, that's a few gigabytes in size, and you could share that through Google Drive as a hyperlink, and that could even have some revisions. So imagine having a 5 gigabyte video and 5 revisions of it. You have like 25 gigabytes of information. If you try to stuff all that into an email messages attachments, then you're gonna have some problems because most email tools are not really designed to work with that type of attachment volume, because most email service providers have some strict limits on how big attachments can be. So email tools are designed to deal with attachments that are, 25 megabytes, 50 megabytes, let's say 100 megabytes, but not really 25 gigs. So that would be also another pain point, I feel, if we let that happen. So for the time being, the road we chose is to create separate zip files. Zip files can get pretty big, and we don't really alter the original email, because the email that you see within the zip file itself is an exact copy of what we had collected earlier, so unmodified, essentially. Well, something else that we need to address still is this, and this question came up before, and this is something we're working on now. Imagine that you have all these drive attachment revisions, right? So when you're collecting the drive attachment and its revisions from Google Drive during the acquisition, you're accessing a live file. It's living on Google Drive, and that drive attachment or revisions could have changed after that parent email was sent originally. So currently, you can kind of make sense of it by collecting all the revisions, and then you would look at the modification times of the revisions, and you can infer that, because this particular revision was modified at this time, you can say, this is the last modification that happened before the parent email was sent. So this is likely how this revision was sent out with the email. But we want to kind of automate this too. So when we're collecting revisions, we want to give you the option to narrow it down to just collecting the last modified revision before the parent email was sent, so that you get the revision that's the closest to what was actually included with the email. So that's something that's in the works. So hopefully, if all goes well, you should expect to see a new version with an additional option there in the Gmail API settings, where we limit the acquisition of the revisions to the last modified revision before the parent email was sent. That's a mouthful. All right, so let's see if we have any questions on this. No, we don't have any questions on the Google Drive revisions. One of the things that I wanted to show you while we're here, this is something I touched on a long time ago, but it hasn't come up since then. So I want to remind you of this. When we do Google Gmail and G Suite acquisitions, one of the things that we capture is Mailbox Rules. This is stored here. So this is the filters that are set on the Gmail account. You know how you can go to Gmail's web interface and set some filters up there. The reasoning for this is mostly for incident response scenarios, because if a bad actor gets access to a mailbox, one of the things they usually do is to set up some filters to divert messages so that they're automatically sent to an external domain, for example. So this could come up in a case, and it's good to have that documented, so that even if you don't know about this now, you might have to go back and look at that filter information. So as you're doing the acquisition, we capture that automatically for you. All right. Let's see if we have anything else they wanted to touch on here. Oh, another thing that I wanted to address here. Number one, I didn't show you how the packaged MSGs look. So the packaged MSGs are essentially the same thing, but instead of the EML version, you get the MSG version here. And a question that we get frequently again is the PST. So some of you are wondering, so we have these drive attachments and revisions, and we associate them with the MIME and the MSG versions of the emails, and what do we do about the PST? Well, the answer to that is the PST version remains untouched, because we don't have the individual messages like we have in the MIME and MSG version. So if you want to have that type of bundling to occur between the parent document, the parent email, and its drive attachments and revisions, then you want to choose one of these two options, either MIME or MSG option, so that FEC can package that. And you'll see that when we actually go through with the acquisition. Go back here. want to include this here. So if you uncheck this and if you check the PST format, then you're not going to see a packaging option here. So this is something that's only applicable to the MIME and the MSG format. Let's take one step back. I wanted to address that search report question I got earlier because that was something I wanted to tackle and I kind of forgot to deal with that. So let me go back to this screen here and let's run a quick search so I can show you how those reports look. So let's say that I want to load a bunch of expressions from a file like this and execute them and get my searches for them. So once I have this, then I can export a report. So let me create a folder here and call it search report. All right, so if I go back here, you'll see that the format of this depends on your preferences in FEC. So for example, here, if you choose CSV, then all the reports that you export will come in CSV format. You could choose TSV or concordance for that. TSV is tab separated values. Stack button text is where we were. So this search report looks something along these lines. We have the search counts, the status, and the total hits, and how many hits we got per item. And if we were to proceed with that acquisition, let's see, I don't think I saved that, so let me do it again. Search terms, convert to query, save, run. So the question was, do we get to see where those search hits are coming from when we actually complete the acquisition? And my answer was yes. So you're going to see how that looks in a second. Let's finish this up here. All right, so when you look at the items folder in mine, for example, we have these different, because this was Gmail, we have the concept of labels. So under mine, we have the different Gmail labels that were applied to the items. So your search terms are coming from these labels, and you see that here. And also in the logs, in the downloaded items log, you essentially see also that label detail here as far as what Gmail labels were applied to each search term that you have. This is a funky one for testing that I had created just to make sure we handle all that crazy characters and label names correctly. So let's move on to the next thing in my agenda, and that's to talk a little bit on preparing and running batch acquisitions again, because this is something that comes up quite often, and I feel like it's one of the usual useful functions FEC has now. Some of our users are pulling down hundreds of mailboxes with this batch acquisition technique or functionality, and we will improve on this, but for the time being, I'll show you how it works. And if you have some suggestions, we're happy to hear them. So we kind of did something like this before too. I'm just going to do this as a quick refresher. So let's do a number of Office 365 mailboxes using impersonation. So I'm going to start with my main acquisition project, put in my own email address. I'm going to use auth. You could use traditional credentials too, but some Exchange servers do not allow it, so I recommend using auth when you can. I'm going to check this use impersonation option. That's because my user here has the application impersonation permission, so it can impersonate other users' mailboxes or other users, let's say. So I'm going to pivot off of my mailbox to get access to other users' mailboxes and preserve them. So I'm going to check this checkbox here, and I'm going to hit this add additional targets button, and I'm going to load this file just so you see how this looks. I'm going to open this up first. So this is essentially a long list, not that long, but about 51 additional targets that are all mailboxes that end with metaspike.com. At the top, there's a header field that says target email. I'm going to load this up. It says 51 additional targets have been loaded. There's a little preview of them here. So we're good there. Let's move on. Let's choose this option. Authenticate as me. Okay, so we're in my mailbox now, as you see here, and we see the contents of the mailbox. A couple of things I wanted to point out here while we're here is, number one, towards the end, don't forget that we covered the recoverable items route. So this deletions, for example, this used to be called the exchange dumpster. So you get access to previously deleted items that are within the service retention period that haven't been purged yet. By default, it's checked, so you don't have to worry about it, but just know that it is one of the things that you capture unless you uncheck it. And then here we have this area that's called archive route. This is a separate mailbox called the archive mailbox. It's also called the exchange in place archive. This is where, depending on the server's retention policy, all the email messages that are beyond the retention period go. For example, if you set your exchange server up so that messages older than 90 days get moved to archive, then all those messages automatically get pushed to archive when the time comes, and they get stored here. And if you were to do an Office 365 acquisition via Imap, for example, you wouldn't get the recoverable items route or the archive route. You would only get the main mailbox. So this is something to keep in mind, that a lot of times you'll find that there's a lot more information in the archive route than there is in the main mailbox. So here I can do a couple of things. Number one, I could proceed with my own acquisition here for this mailbox, but there's a button here because I added some targets that says create additional projects. So I could create additional projects for acquisition here. And then I could also add some search terms here. For example, let's say that let's say I add a few terms here, some basic terms without getting into too much detail, and I save them. So now that I save this in-place search query, if I create my additional projects now, all the additional projects that are created are going to inherit this in-place search query that I have here. So they're all going to have their in-place search query set to those terms that I had selected. So the benefit of that is you can have a predefined search query across all the mailboxes, set it up here in your individual acquisition, and then have it be pushed down to all your subsequent acquisition projects. So at this point, I could charge ahead with this acquisition right now if I wanted to, or I could stop this and go take a look at how my folder looks. And it looks like this. So I haven't run anything yet, but I have my 52 acquisition sessions here as FEC projects that are separate. And then I have a batch file that looks like this. So this is essentially tapping into FEC's command line support. So it's launching fec.exe with the argument of the FEC project file that we want to launch. The start parameter allows you to start or resume a project depending on what state it's in. And then this auto close command line argument tells FEC to not be fussy. So at the end of the acquisition, it doesn't display the completion dialog box or any error messages or anything like that. It will silently close and let you move on to the next one automatically. So one thing that I tell people often is this: there are a couple of interesting things here. Number one, when you run this batch file, it'll kick off the acquisitions one after the other in order. They're not going to be launched at the same time. They're going to be launched one after the other. The second thing is, if everything finishes and you rerun it, then FEC is going to scan through all those acquisition projects, and it's going to resume any of them that need resuming. So if any of them have any missing items, incomplete acquisition, they'll be resumed automatically. So you could just run the batch file, let it run and finish, go back and rerun it until there's nothing else to collect and be done with it. Another thing that I like doing is when you're doing all that, you could have your email notifications set up. This takes a couple of settings to set your sender address, the recipient address. This could be like a distribution list for your department, for example. How you want to send it, like directly from your computer, from the computer that FEC is running, or using a relay server like Mailgun or SendGrid or something. And you set things up. You can send a test email to test. The beauty of this is that if you set it up like this, then in between each acquisition that gets completed, FEC is going to shoot you an email automatically with a status update. So you run your projects in batch mode like this. Let's say you have 51 mailboxes. Then as each mailbox is completed, you'll get an email saying this mailbox, this acquisition project is finished. Everything went well, or there are a couple of items that couldn't be collected. So you have a record of those and you can either go back and revisit them or you know what to do about them. The other thing is this batch file, of course, is customizable. So you could, for example, slice this and dice this and take you know, some of these out into a different batch file. Let's say that a couple of them are priorities and you want to separate them, then you could. You could do something like that, and then you can just run them separately. Or another method here is that, let's say you have a very large number of mailboxes to collect, let's say 1,000, right? And you want to do some type of parallel processing. You could split this into chunks. So you could split this into batches of 50, for example, put each batch on a different computer and run them in parallel using different instances of FEC on different computers if you wanted to. Just be mindful of server throttling there. If you hit the same organization's mailboxes all at the same time on multiple threads on different computers, then Microsoft or whoever the service provider is might complain and slow things down a little bit. But just to show you, so if I wanted to run these priority mailboxes, for example, one after the other, then I can launch this. It'll launch the first acquisition session. It's not going to ask for user input. It's just going to kick it off automatically. It ran the search already. It's actually running the search, and the number of items is growing as we're going through the different mailbox folders. It's running that search for a couple of terms that we specify. So let's say that I cancel this. It'll move on to the next mailbox. If I cancel this too, I normally wouldn't cancel like that, at least I hope. I'm just trying to show you that number one, it's a little bit resilient, and number two, what happens if you cancel, then if you hit it again, it'll pick it back up. So it'll keep snapshotting the remaining folders and stuff. But like I said, although you see me just Xing out of these windows, normally what I would like you to do is, if possible, hit this stop button so that it closes gracefully. One of the things that I've heard is that sometimes people navigate away from this and they don't know their way back. But if you go away, you should be able to back out of there using the back button. Okay, so in summary, a couple of things here that I wanted to emphasize again. Number one, you can modify the batch file to suit your needs. You can run it and rerun it to essentially resume the acquisition across the board on all the projects and run them to completion. And you would get your notification emails along the way as you're hitting the different acquisition projects. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is the changes we made to Remote Authenticator. Let me bring this into view here. So in our documentation about the Remote Authenticator, you'll notice that we have some additions here where we talk about advanced scope customization via file name. It sounds very important, but really all it does is we had some requests from our users that sometimes they wanted to send Remote Authenticator to an end user. And when you do that, the default mode that the Remote Authenticator operates in is to get permissions for everything. because we don't know on your end what you'll do with that token later on. For example, you might get a token from a user and maybe your intention is to use that for Imap, which requires full permissions on Gmail. And maybe you want to also collect drive attachments and calendar and stuff. So we get all those permissions in the token so that you're free to do what you need on your end. But sometimes that could be a concern because let's say that the acquisition scope is just Gmail and the user might be particularly privacy conscious and they might say, well, why do you need access to my Google Drive or my Google Calendar or my or full access to my Gmail in a way that you could edit my messages or delete them or send messages on my behalf. So we brought some possibilities here to reduce that scope if you needed to, and that's done solely by adjusting the name of the executable. So you could download Remote Authenticator here. All right, so let's see here. Let me grab a copy of that from where I got it, just a second. Okay. Okay, so that's how Remote Authenticator is downloaded. So now if we wanted to change the scopes that it requests, we had a couple of options here. One of them was to actually build some options within the tool. So when you run it, the end user could check some checkboxes, for example, to define exactly what scopes to request. But we didn't think that that was a very good idea because number one, it leaves a margin of error. The end user could choose the wrong options, or they may not know what to choose, or they might get simply confused. We wanted to give that control to the requester so that as the requester, you set things up the way you want it, and then you send it to the end user and they can just mindlessly click and authenticate. So to facilitate that, we decided that it's a better idea to put those flags in the name of the tool so that you get the access you need without having to ask the user. So for example, if you were to rename the tool to something like this, where in the middle of the name, you're putting these R, D, and C flags, then that tells you that this is going to request access to Gmail in read-only mode, Google Drive in read-only mode, and Google Calendar in read-only mode. So this would, for example, get you access to all the Gmail API stuff, but you could not do an IMAP acquisition with it because you don't have full access to the Gmail account. So this would be sufficient, for example, for most cases. So if the user just runs it like this, you'll see that we're only viewing the email messages and settings, but we're not able to modify or send emails on the user's behalf. We can see and download the drive files, we can view the events, and we can view the calendars. So it's giving us limited access. And then, as usual, you can just save this token. And work with it. It would be a good idea probably to name these tokens accordingly so that you know what permissions are in the token in case you forget how Remote Authenticator was set up. So I just thought of that, and perhaps it might be something to add. So maybe if Remote Authenticator creates a token with limited scopes, we could name this token file to reflect that so that you know that it's a limited scope token, not a full token, so it doesn't leave any room for confusion later on. All right, let's go back here. I think we're coming to the end of our time here, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but just want to take a quick look at the questions here to see if there's anything I missed. I see another question from Stig here saying, speaking of cloud storage and drive attachments, is a forensic cloud collector still something you're looking into? Yes, we are looking into a cloud collector. So that's something that I feel like we can bring some value. The plan there is to I think, have a similar workflow to what you see with FEC, where you can utilize in-place search capabilities of the providers, maybe see the items up front and filter them before you collect, and tap into enterprise authentication like you do with FEC, so you can use domain-wide delegation with Google, impersonation, and delegate access to Exchange. Well, not Exchange, but in that case, it would be Office 365 and OneDrive. And target entire storage services. So instead of focusing on just the user's email attachments that are on Google Drive, just target Drive entirely and search and collect users' Google Drive, Dropbox, or OneDrive. So that's something that we're thinking about. There are actually two tools that we're thinking about developing in the near future. That's one of them. The other one is email related, and it's kind of a surprise. I'm not sure which one will come first, but we're working on those actively. And now that everybody's working from home and things are slow, it's a good time to kind of put our heads down and work on those tools, I think. So expect something soon on that front. All right, I think that's all I have so far. So I will stop sharing my screen here. Turn here, yes, and thanks again everyone for joining. Hope to see you again soon. We'll probably have another webinar soon to talk about, I'm thinking maybe email forensics, something along those lines where people can join in from home and participate, because I was going to some conferences to present, and now, as crazy as things are now, it doesn't make sense to do a lot of in-person appearances. So I'll try to schedule something to talk more generally about email forensics and cloud forensics, hopefully. So expect a notification on that soon. And if you have any questions or anything we can help with, feel free to get in touch. Thanks again and have a good day.